Welcome to the Mid-Atlantic Association of Museums virtual program, Redefining Narrative, a series of conversations with scholars and leaders in the cultural sector. I'm Deborah Schwartz, and I serve on the Mid-Atlantic Association of Museums Board of Directors, and I'm delighted to be your host. Redefining Narrative invites viewers to explore new approaches to working within the cultural sector, presenting fresh ideas about the pressing issues of our time, and in many cases, disrupting age-old formulas for what we expect to find within the confines of museums. Each episode is approximately 30 minutes, and we hope that each of our 5-part series will encourage conversation and debate for people working in museums, as well as students and the general public who are curious about why and how museums make choices about their exhibitions and programs and beyond. With much appreciation, on behalf of the staff and board of MAM, I want to acknowledge that this program was funded in part by Humanities New York with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. In today's episode of Redefining Narrative, we will look at a topic that involves the internal operation of museums, the history and present state of labor organizing in museums. Our guest today is Dana Kopel. Dana is a writer, editor, and union organizer living in New York. Her writing appears in publications such as The Nation, The Baffler, Frieze, Flash Art, Art in America, and Sense. Formerly the senior editor and publication coordinator at the New Museum, she helped organize the New Museum Union, UAW Local 2110, and subsequently worked for 2 years as an organizer for the Office and Professional Employees International Union, the OPEIU, Local 153. She holds an MA from the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College and is currently a PhD candidate in history at UCLA. As an article in the New York Times recently reported, workers in nearly 24 American museums, I'm not sure that number may be larger by now, have created collective bargaining units in recent years to push for better pay and working conditions. Dana will talk with us about the wave of successful union organizing efforts that have happened in American museums and will reflect on the history of labor in the cultural sector, as well as the future of organized labor in America. Welcome, Dana.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen. So over the past 3.5 years, museum and art workers have decided that enough is enough. Spurred by low pay, overwork, and numerous other issues, workers across the US have unionized at institutions including the New Museum, where I used to work, the Whitney, the Guggenheim, the American Museum of Natural History, the Brooklyn Museum, the Tenement Museum, and the Jewish Museum in New York, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Milwaukee Art Museum, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Carnegie Museums in Pittsburgh, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Portland Museum of Art in Maine, the New Children's Museum in San Diego, the Museum of Contemporary Art, the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures, and the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles, and the list goes on. Just a few days ago, workers at Dia Art Foundation filed a petition for a union election with the National Labor Relations Board. Vernon Byron, who has worked at Dia for 11 years, explained that staff are organizing to secure, quote, more opportunities for development in addition to achieving a living wage and more sensible working conditions. These unionization efforts are rarely easy. Despite the progressive public face of most museums, leadership is often more interested in preserving their own power than in allowing staff a seat at the table, with some museums spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on anti-union consultants and law firms. But the workers, by and large, are winning. Newly unionized workers at many of these museums are now in the process of bargaining their first contracts with management, another key stage in the fight for workers' rights and collective power. As a former museum worker and one of the organizers of the New Museum Union, I've been excited to see and participate in this wave of museum unionization and of an increasingly empowered labor movement. So I'm speaking from my own experience here, which has taken me from working in contemporary art to working as a union organizer for the Office and Professional Employees International Union, Local 153, to starting a PhD in US labor history. In the fall of 2016, I started working as an editor at the New Museum in New York after finishing my master's degree. And I worked there for around 3.5 years. And during that time, I became part of an organizing effort that resulted in my colleagues and I forming the New Museum Union. I then served as a member of our bargaining committee, a group of union members elected to represent the union in contract negotiations. And finally, I served as our unit chair, which is an elected position responsible for handling grievances and supporting other union members. And so a union is a collective project by nature. This is something I always say when I do talks like this, just to be clear, it's me that I'm speaking to you here, but as you can see in the photo, there are many others who are fundamental to forming the New Museum Union and who are keeping it going today. The New Museum Union represents office staff, front-facing staff, and visitor services in the store, and part-time art handlers and registrars. We voted to form a union in January 2019, winning our vote by a huge margin. We were the first major US museum to unionize since the 1970s, when workers at MoMA in New York and SF MoMA in San Francisco formed unions. Like more than 90 of my New Museum colleagues and thousands of other museum workers nationally, I was furloughed at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic and then was laid off, along with our 2 union stewards and a number of other vocal supporters at the end of June 2020. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the process of forming our union and what inspired it. And I want to note that even before we made the decision to unionize, my coworkers and I met together regularly to discuss the changes we wanted to see at the museum. And we started each of these meetings with a salary share, which is a powerful organizing tool and one that has since gained a bigger platform in the art world with, for instance, Kimberly Drew's keynote presentation at the American Alliance of Museums a few years ago, and the museum salary spreadsheet started by Art and Museum Transparency in 2019. At the New Museum, we decided to unionize for a confluence of reasons, some of which were more particular to that museum, including egregiously low pay and a huge disparity between executive and low-level salaries, a culture of disposability that resulted in massive turnover, and a real gap between the museum's outward-facing progressive politics and its internal dynamics. The New Museum was founded in a one-room office in 1977 by Marcia Tucker, who had been a curator at the Whitney Museum before she was fired. She formed the New Museum not only to show new art, including the post-minimal work that many other museums were still hostile to at the time, but also to reimagine what a museum is, what it should do, and who it should serve. She had some radical ideas about doing this, including paying all staff the same salary and foregoing hierarchies by having everyone rotate jobs. Unfortunately, these proposals didn't last long. Tucker founded the New Museum on the heels of an earlier moment of upheaval for art workers. In the late 1960s, artists and art workers such as Donald Judd, Lucy Lippard, and Howardina Pindell created the Art Workers Coalition. Inspired in part by the Depression-era artists' unions of the 1930s, as well as the political and social movements of their own time, the Art Workers Coalition put forth a number of demands to Bates Lowry, then director of MoMA. Among them, that artists be paid when their work was featured in an exhibition, and that they have the right to refuse to have their work included in collection shows. That the museum devote a section to Black artists under the direction of Black artists, and another section to artists without gallery representation. And that admission should always be free, with the museum open until midnight, 2 nights a week. Only a few years later, some of the first museum unions were formed. In 1971, staff at MoMA in New York organized the Professional and Administrative Staff Association, or PASTA for short, in order to improve wages, promotions, and job security, and to give staff a say in policy decisions at the museum. Staff at San Francisco's Museum of Modern Art unionized the following year. MoMA's union went on strike twice in the first 3 years of its existence. It's important to note, though, that PASTA founders were quick to distinguish themselves from the blue-collar workers that comprised the majority of union membership at that time. a classist attitude that undermines all workers, and one that thankfully doesn't seem to characterize much recent museum union organizing. Looking back at that history, it's jarring to see how many of the demands of groups like the Art Workers Coalition, like involving museum workers and artists in policy decisions and free admission for all, are still relevant today, and that some even feel far beyond what we can demand now. The horizon of possibility has been so limited by increasingly corporate museum leadership that we're expected to just be grateful to have a museum job in the first place. But conditions of the past few years are, I think, transforming that attitude. Not only are museum workers forming unions, they're also spearheading more organizing efforts in response to both the pandemic and the Black-led uprisings of summer 2020, calling out the entrenched racism and inequity of institutions and demanding accountability. I'm not convinced that the museums we have can be made equitable or anti-racist. Looking to the history of museums makes clear that they are structurally designed to expropriate, loot, and uphold stratifications of race and class. But I'm encouraged by the organizing that's been happening. Many of the reasons we decided to unionize at the new museum are prevalent throughout the museum world, including low pay and a prestige job mentality that tend to prevent people without outside sources of financial support from getting a foothold in the museum world, which then perpetuates the class and race-based exclusions that have characterized this field from the start. Since our unionization, I've spoken to a lot of people working at other institutions and seen how many of these issues impact workers across the art world and beyond it. At the new museum, we wanted to change the landscape, the sense of what's possible and what people deserve, not just our own conditions. And so starting in March of 2019 and through the beginning of October of that year, we met with new museum management and their lawyer regularly to negotiate our first contract. Salary concerns were a huge focus in our negotiations, of course, but we also prioritized less tangible concerns, like the right to a pay increase when you take on someone else's work temporarily, and the right to hold union meetings at the museum. Everything that made it into the contract demanded a huge fight. Management was resistant to even the most basic proposals, like having union bulletin boards in staff break areas. In June of 2019, 3 months into contract negotiations, we held an action outside the museum during exhibition openings, in which more than 100 union members and supporters rallied to pressure the museum to negotiate more fairly with us. And ultimately, we had to call a strike vote and prepare to go on strike in order to create enough pressure to win a fair contract. There hasn't, to my knowledge, been a major museum strike in the US since MoMA workers went on strike for more than 4 months in 2000, though 43 art handlers at Sotheby's who were unionized with the Teamsters picketed in 2011 in response to a lockout by the employer. As a result of their strike, MoMA staff won a contract with substantial pay increases and a closed shop, which means that everyone in union positions is automatically in the union, which makes the union stronger. I also want to acknowledge that art workers are not a homogeneous group. People come from different conditions and have different needs and expectations. Certain forms of labor within the museum are racialized, classed, and gendered. At the new museum, we prioritize bringing the bottom up, making sure we won real improvements for the lowest paid people in our unit. Our contract brought the minimum salary for workers in visitor services in the store up from $15.50 to a minimum of $18 an hour when it went into effect. That minimum hit almost $20 this month. And for context, these workers hadn't had a raise in over 3 years, and they represent the majority of the staff of color in our unit. I think this is a big moment of reckoning for museums, particularly modern and contemporary art museums, though it's not the first. Many of these museums now profit from a veneer of progressive politics and a surface level commitment to fair representation, but actually function according to capitalist principles of profit and growth, rather than any sort of ethics or drive toward justice. This is something I've seen firsthand at the new museum, and that many saw, for example, with the 2019 Whitney Biennial and the eventual removal of Warren Kanders, CEO of the tear gas manufacturer Safariland, from the Whitney's board, as well as the ongoing campaign to get Larry Fink, MoMA trustee and CEO of BlackRock, to divest from prison companies like CoreCivic and Geo Group, which together are responsible for 70% of immigrant detention in the US. The question I've been asking myself for a while now is, what does representation actually do if it's funded by incarceration and brutality toward activists and protesters in Ferguson, in Standing Rock, at the US border, in Palestine, in Hong Kong, and around the world? As Aria Dean writes in her review of that Whitney Biennial for Extra, quote, "Representation is betrayed by its own nomenclature, which alerts us to the fact that it is not real and it does not make it its business to intervene into material conditions. Representation is a gloss." Unfortunately, the mass layoffs and furloughs that have swept museums in response to the ongoing COVID crisis only reinforce this disparity between public-facing and internal, or I would say actual, politics. Tens of thousands of museum workers in the US lost their jobs, most of them in lower paid positions, while executives took small symbolic pay cuts that preserved their own jobs and their power. For reference, the new museum director took a 30% pay cut. 30% of her salary is still several times the average union member's salary. Meanwhile, the vast majority of union supporters, myself included, were unceremoniously laid off. So how do we counter the surface level representation only progressivism that so many museums put forward and profit from? Because representing left politics isn't the same as enacting them, though both can happen at once. And the openness to various interpretations that characterizes the approach of many museums easily falls into a kind of liberal both sidesism, especially when it's propagated by neoliberal institutions. And that isn't accessibility or equity or justice. I think this gap between what museums do outwardly, representationally, or what they say they're doing, and how they're actually functioning internally at the level of material conditions and geopolitical impact, is a space in which unions can intervene to improve conditions for workers within the museum, but also to hold museum management accountable and to set higher standards and better ethics for cultural institutions more broadly. Unions aren't the endpoint, of course, but they are a crucial means of advocating effectively for workers' rights and a useful model for collective action and building solidarity. When our union voted to authorize a strike at the new museum in late September of 2019, we as organizers had to explain to our colleagues and to exhibiting artists, museum visitors, and so on, that you either stand with workers and support our fight for a fair contract, or you cross the picket line and side with management with the exploitation and abuse they perpetuate. There's no middle ground in a strike. In my work as a writer and union organizer, I'm committed to pushing back against this surface progressivism by centering workers' rights and insisting on a complete transformation of the power structures that undergird institutions. As a union organizer, I worked primarily with workers at mission-driven or service-based, quote-unquote, progressive nonprofits, and I've been struck by how similar dynamics are across these workplaces and museums, which are also nonprofits. There's usually an unwillingness on the part of leadership to share power with staff, which manifests in union busting and other abuses that disproportionately affect staff of color and working class staff in lower level positions. Workers are expected to handle unmanageable workloads on unlivable salaries, whereas in museums, the trade-off is the apparent prestige of these jobs and employees' own passion. In service-based nonprofits, it's employees' sense of responsibility to support vulnerable communities, even at the expense of their own well-being. But whatever the justification, this attitude is unsustainable and unethical, and I'm thrilled to see and support workers fighting back. I've been heartened by the real solidarity I've seen and experienced among members of different museum unions and art workers trying to unionize. We've shared knowledge, offered encouragement, shown up to rallies, and made public statements of support. Even though I no longer work at a museum, I know this is happening with every successful union election, every contract that museum unions win. And this is not just museum unions, but unions that are forming across different sectors, from nonprofits to Amazon warehouses, to the cascade of recent organizing at Starbucks coffee shops across the country. Museum workers and other workers are coming to recognize themselves as workers, and that makes all of us stronger in the fight for our rights at work.
Thank you so much, Dana. That was great. What an incredible overview you've given us of so many really profound issues. I can't thank you enough for the presentation. I'd like to just dig in and ask you some questions that I think are very much pulled from your comments. Before I do that, I just want to acknowledge Amanda and Rachel, our sign language interpreters, who have been taking turns doing this. So thank you both for helping to facilitate this presentation. So Dana, I think one of the things that you made me think about, one of the many things you made me think about as I was listening to your presentation is a perception I have that cultural workers have for many decades sort of distanced themselves from other kinds of labor, sort of in some way making the claim or sort of acting on the idea that they are different, special, that the issues are different. And I wonder if you've seen that or how you've seen that change over time.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really important point. And something I mentioned, as you said, in my talk about the people who formed MoMA's first staff association union, who were very clear, like, we're not like those other blue collar workers. The work we do is different. I think that's, incredibly harmful. And it's not just harmful to those other workers, it's harmful to us as cultural workers. It creates divisions when we need to be coming together. You're doing the boss's work for them, basically. And that's something that I really haven't seen in my experience of museum union organizing so much now. There is still a bit of that exceptionalism, I think. But for the most part, the people leading these union drives understand that, like, the way to win is to stand in solidarity with workers in totally different industries, and other workers in your own industry. And I think that's been really powerful. As when I've worked as a union organizer, I would like help nonprofit groups organize, and there'd be a point once they went public where they would see some other union like shared their tweet, or like they shared another union's tweet, something would click and they'd be like, oh, we're part of something bigger. And I think that's really powerful, and that's the way forward.
Yeah, when I worked many years ago at the Brooklyn Museum, I was in the union, and one of the interesting things, it was, the AFSCME, state, city, and local municipal employees. And one of the things that was interesting was it was a different unit than the employees in the museum who did, the mechanical and operations stuff. And instead, we, the museum educators, were put together with librarians in other institutions and nurses in hospitals. So in fact, we actually had less in common with those folks than we would have if we were in the union with the folks who actually worked in the museum in very different capacities. But it always struck me as something that it sort of led to its own form of marginalization to have it organized that way.
Yeah, completely. And I think that's often something that employers want. They want the smallest unions possible and the most divided and separate groups of workers possible, because when workers come together and start talking about the issues that they're facing, they come to see that A, the issues are not that different, and B, they can change them if they come together.
So I also wanted to ask you a question. I'm a little, I worry that I'm going to sound a little naive, but bear with me, which has to do with, something that I have seen as I've sort of been following with great interest, this, growing movement. And I've seen in a couple of cases, museums where the trustees and the leadership of the institution poured enormous amounts of money into fighting the union, legal battles that cost, I don't know how much money, when it it seemed to me that that money could have so easily been spent on, sort of making this thing happen in a way that was positive, and that would have left fewer scars, fewer, bodies on the ground. And I guess my question to you is, is there an effort that you've seen made to educate trustees, educate, museum directors about what might make this actually something positive ultimately for them?
Yeah, it's a good question and a tricky question, because you're right. Most, you know, museum leaders, like most leaders of any company, like they fight a union effort. That's exactly what happened at the new museum. They spent $600,000 on one law firm over 1 year. And that doesn't include the other law firm they had first, or the anti-union consultant they had before that. So it's just, yeah, you see this like massive amount of money, and staff are like, I need more than, $40,000 a year to live in New York City and work this job. And somehow there's no money for that, but there's money for the anti-union lawyers. I think that there's not, to my knowledge, some sort of external like body trying to educate museum leadership about this. I think there have been conversations in some of those circles. I have been part of not conversations with museum leaders, but with like museum staff who may not be union eligible at certain points. But I do think a lot of that communication does come from the workers. Most workers like announce their intent to unionize with a letter to management. And I think those letters, from what I've seen, usually foreground like how much they care about the work that they do, and want to make it better. And I think there's a real effort there to keep things positive, and to sort of explain the process and explain the thinking behind it in a way that's generative. And I think those are the best situated people to speak to it, and also the ones most easily shut down by management.
It's, what you're making me think about is I teach now in a museum studies program, in a master's program at Johns Hopkins. And I actually think, those kinds of programs where very often the students express their interests, their aspirations to positions of leadership in museums, that actually would be a really interesting place to lay some of the groundwork for a discussion with people who are, say in mid-level jobs now, but aspire to leadership roles. And you're making me think that it might be really fun to propose some kind of a course like that, to just introduce people to this in a different way, perhaps in a way that not under pressure, not under, not at that moment when you may have pressure from your trustees saying, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. But it's interesting to think about where those kinds of lessons learned could be most impactful. The other piece that again, I'm going to speak a little bit from my personal experience. I was the deputy director at the Museum of Modern Art after that 2000 strike. So the strike was over by the time I got there. And one of the things that I saw was people who had kept their jobs, who were very active in that labor strike, and in that activity and the push, but they were kind of ignored. They were really, really good people, and they were sort of not listened to. And it felt to me that it was somewhat of a residue of their activism during the push, and for the union. And so I wonder again, whether you have any thoughts about that kind of, so after these really intensive fights happen, is it just inevitable that the people who were so active in the work end up leaving? Or have you seen people who have figured out how to build new relationships?
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, I know some people stay, others leave. A lot of people leave involuntarily. I mean, that's what happened with me and my colleagues. And yeah, what I would always tell workers I was helping to organize in my last job is like, retaliation for union organizing or union activism of any kind is illegal in the US, and it happens all the time. And employers are really good at sort of couching it in, like personal relationships or like just, like decisions about your work or, just like something that's like just this side of legal or like, laying their tracks so that they can fire you or whatever. Like, it happens. And labor law in this country is trash. So there's, even when it's like blatantly retaliatory, it can be hard to prove that legally. And I think that's why like organizing is an ongoing struggle, like within workplaces and outside of them, obviously. Like you have these big moments like the strike, and then like you have the time in between where you're like really laying the groundwork, bringing people in. I mean, it's hard for me to speak to sort of like what, how can that kind of situation that you're talking about be avoided? Because for my end, like for my position, I'm just like, well, management could not retaliate. But if they listened to me, we'd be in a very different
Yeah,
situation.
yeah,
Um, so
yeah. I think, part of what struck me was these were people who did stay and who ultimately, at least in some of the cases I'm thinking about, we were able to say, hey, you're not paying attention to somebody who's actually a really, really talented staff member. They didn't leave after the unionization process. They're still here. You're not, you're clearly deliberately not paying attention to them, but there's a lot of good reasons to pay attention to these people because they are really talented. And as they said to you at the beginning of this whole process, undoubtedly, they're very devoted to the museum. So I saw a few of those situations turn around, but I wasn't there to kind of see what the whole experience had been, the whole cycle of, what was really, really hard. So, it's just something I've reflected on. I would love to switch gears a little bit now to two things. One is I'm really fascinated by your now starting down this road of getting your PhD in labor history, which is so fascinating and wonderful. Congratulations on that. And I'd love to hear a little bit about it, but also it connects me to the question of how museums actually represent labor history in their public facing work. So whether it's in history museums or other kinds of museums, I think it's actually a part of American history that is probably underrepresented in museums. There are a few examples. I think there was actually probably largely during the pandemic, unfortunately, the Museum of the City of New York had an exhibition called City of Workers, City of Struggle, How Labor Movements Changed New York. Now that wasn't about museum unions, obviously, but it was, I think, an interesting exhibition about the history of labor in the city. I'm just wondering whether you've, had any thoughts about exhibitions past or, future that you would want to comment on.
Yeah, I honestly think you're probably more knowledgeable about this than I am. with my PhD, the project I applied to work on is sort of a history of labor organizing in the art world. That's
Fabulous.
research I wanted to do for a long time, and it's just hard to do research when you have a full-time job. So, but yeah, I missed that show because of the pandemic,
Yeah.
and I think there's a lot that I, still have to learn about. I think there's also, as you're saying, like the way in which this is underrepresented in the US. I know I've spent time in Copenhagen, and there's a workers museum, and it's a really amazing little museum, details sort of like the history of work in Denmark and also of labor struggles. And yeah, I don't think there's anything quite
Yeah.
like in our capital city.
No, I think that's right. I was looking at the Smithsonian Museum of American History, and they had an exhibit also that closed earlier this year called All Work and No Pay, which is an exhibition about women and unpaid labor, which, mostly obviously in the domestic realm, that looked like a really fascinating exhibit. And they took it and did a really nice job of turning it into an online exhibition, which made me then also wonder about, the potential and the possibilities for online investigations of this history of labor, that I'm sure there are, many of them that I don't know, but I suspect a lot of them are in kind of academic context. And it occurred to me that now that museums have so much more of an online presence because of the pandemic, that, it would be my hope that we could use that to sort of perhaps amplify some of that history. Maybe your PhD will help us get there. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you, though. I think maybe also some of why there hasn't been more of that in recent years, even though there has been this like very recent conversation around museum unions, is sort of like, if you put on a show about labor, as a museum, that's going to expose you to more scrutiny about your internal labor processes, as it should. But I think that's something probably that museum management generally is going to be wary of.
Happily, I think that, and in another part of this series, we're actually going to be speaking with Zahir Ali, who is a historian and oral historian in particular. And I think, the oral history arm of museum work, which I think is a kind of growing interest, not even only in history museums, but in other kinds of museums as well. That's also going to be kind of an exciting place where some of the stories of you, your colleagues, the other people who have been through these experiences, hopefully will land at some point, and be, turned into some kind of oral history archive, that could be really exciting for people to have access to. So
yeah, that would be amazing. I would love to see that happen.
So, Dana, any last thoughts for us?
No, thank you so much for having me and for talking with me.
And thank you. And we look forward to seeing the fruits of your labors while you work on your PhD. And thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Of course. Thank you.